Okay, so this will just be kind of a brief overview of the history of the Bible, how the Bible that we have today came to be, how the inspired Word of God came from so many different books and so many centuries to come together to what we have today. And so first, we start off with just some fun facts. The Bible is a collection of writing. It was written, over 1600 years. So there's quite a few years of writings that take place in the book, written by over 40 kings, prophets, different apostles of God throughout time. The current form we have is the 66 books. And it's been pretty similar to this for quite a while, but not necessarily in the book or verse form that we experience today. And so a lot of times they'll call it the Bible canon, which just comes from pretty much the same word in Greek, which just means a straight rod, a measuring stick, or a standard or rule. So in other words, this is the authoritative collection, the canon of the scriptures. So then we have the Old and New Testament. The Old Testament has 39 books, which we're all pretty familiar with, and it was written, they say, between about the 1400s and the 400 BC. And the reason they say it started at the 1400s, because most biblical scholars will say that Moses wrote the first five books of the Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And most of them say when he wrote that would have been between the exile out of Egypt until his death. So if we agree or think that 1446 is when Moses left them out of Egypt until about 1406, plus or minus, they would say, okay, we think Moses wrote this, and there's a few reasons why we'll get to. And if he did write it, the most logical time he would have wrote this would have been between 1446 and 1406. He's not probably going to write this before he leads the people out, and he's not going to write after he's dead. So if he did write it, it probably has to be within this period of time. So that's why they paid the 1400s. There is something we'll talk about with Job. They don't have any idea when Job was written. But because of the way it was written and the lack of reference to Israel or all that, some people claim Job was either written by Moses or written before Moses. And there is indication not only was there verbal history, there was writings. There was this knowledge had to exist long before Moses. If he's 1400 BC, what about the previous 2000 years of knowledge that people would have transferred on? And so it's kind of interesting to think. So that's kind of where they get the Old Testament. And then the New Testament's a little bit obviously a shorter period from about 48 to 125. And there were a lot of historians at the time that were writing about this. And a lot of these books were written down, or copied afterwards. So that was a lot shorter period of the New Testament history. Hello. And so that's just kind of the general overview of the fun facts of the Bible. So how was this information transferred? That's what I want to talk a lot about. I mean, we got oral tradition versus oral testament. They might have written stuff long before Moses. It might have been written down. We just don't have a lot of proof of that. We got a little bit, but we don't have a lot. So we assumed that it was just oral. The oral history would be, we're going to tell you all these stories. They say oral tradition is where one family transfers it down to the other, but oral testament is, well, not only are you transferring it, you're transferring it accurately with all the dates and the names, and you're actually, spending your life making sure you have a very exact replication of what happened from year to year. And then they get into carvings, but they're not going to reproduce all this knowledge in carvings. So there's different carvings and engraves, but it's not going to be the entire Old Testament or books of the Bible, just parts of that. And a lot of our carvings are going to come from history. The um, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, that will get a little bit of history as far as their battles or their kings, but not the whole Bible. Then we get into scrolls, which we were talking about with Revelations and codexes. And codex is basically, instead of doing a scroll, they started doing paper that folds in half. So it's kind of the precursor to the book. And then of that, they started with papyrus, and then they went into parchment, which we'll talk a little bit about. And then finally, paper between the 11th and 15th century. So say paper as we refer to today was discovered or invented in China about 100 AD, but they kept it secret for a while before they let people expand out. And I put this here because it's interesting. The original paper was made from rags or bark or hemp, just anything they could kind of smash and bang together once they soak it. And then eventually it turned into wood pulp and different things that we have today. So it's kind of this gradual progression of carving into rock to using plant material to using hides and then to paper. So it's pretty neat how the information has been transferred. So the oral tradition versus oral transmission, again, is just trying to say, well, these stories are pretty complex. So not only do you have to transfer the stories, but the details too. And I think some of the stuff that gets transferred which we'll talk about in a bit. There's some archaeological, of course, I'm talking about that, and historical stuff that predates maybe the Bible written by Moses. And they're like, well, there's these stories of the creation, but it doesn't make sense. And there's stories about the flood. So the Bible's just another made up story that they propagated. And I'm like, well, I don't know if that's necessarily true. I think these stories have been transmitted through years, but some of these people were not godly. Some of these people were pagan. So they altered these stories and they put in their false gods. And I think that's a better way to look at that instead of, oh, this proves the Bible wrong. So I want to talk about that a little bit. But one thing we know is there was definitely writings and there was oral traditions we're not familiar with that was taking place before Moses, during Moses, and the Bible tells us about that. So I threw down a couple examples of different things that New Testament writers are saying, well, clearly you guys know this, but we're not told that in the Old Testament that we have. And so one of those examples they give is 2 Timothy 3:8. I'll just pull it up even though I have it written up there. So 2 Timothy chapter 3 verse 8. So now as Jannes and Jambres withstood Moses, so do these also resist the truth, men of corrupt minds, reprobate concerning the faith. And then it goes on, and we're like, well, who are these two people? They're not mentioned in the Old Testament at all. We're not specifically told in our Bible canon who these are. Now, though it's not mentioned there, some Jewish tradition and other Jewish sources says, well, these are the sorcerers who worked the counter miracles against Moses when he was trying to say, let my people go. And that might be the case. And that's in other writings, but that's not specifically given to us. So we know there was some other oral or written stuff going on that we're not familiar with. And then look at James 5:17 when it's talking about Elijah. So Elias or Elijah was a man subject to like passions as we are, and he prayed earnestly that it might not rain, and it rained not on the earth by a space of 3 years and 6 months. That's very specific, but we're not told that in the Old Testament in 1 Kings 17:18. We're told that it went 3 years, like it didn't rain for 3 years, but we're not given the specific 3 years and 6 months till it did start raining. Or there was a drought for 3 years, I think is what that says. So obviously, the New Testament writers knew this, but they knew this, it must have been outside of the Old Testament of what we have today. And if we look, there's tons of references like this in the Bible. These are just a few references of different books that they quote that we're not familiar with or we haven't found yet. So, one example, if you look at Joshua or 2 Samuel, they talk about this book of Joshua. So, Joshua 10, why do I keep getting out of my Bible at? Okay. So Joshua 10, verses 12 and 13. Then spake Joshua to the Lord in the day when the Lord delivered up the Amorites before the children of Israel. And he said in the sight of Israel, Sun, stand thou still upon Gibeon, and thou moon in the valley of Ajalon. And the sun stood still, and the moon stayed, and the people had avenged themselves upon their enemies. Is this not written in the book of Jasher? Like, duh. Don't you remember that? Well, we don't know what the book of Jasher is. But clearly, these people would have been familiar with this. So there was other writings or oral transmissions, but in this case, it's called a book. So there was other writings these people had that we're not familiar with. We can look at Numbers, and it talks about the book of the wars of the Lord. So Numbers 21, 14, and 15. And there's quite a few examples of these, actually. These are just the ones I kind of wrote down quickly. So Numbers 21, 14 and 15. Wherefore it is said in the book of the wars of the Lord, what he did in the Red Sea and in the brooks of Arnon, and it goes on like that. Well, I don't know what the book of the wars of the Lords are. Maybe it was another name for something we have, but I don't think so because they're quoting this. The books of the Acts of Solomon is quoted in 1 Kings 11:41. That's not any book that we're familiar with. And if you read any biblical historians, they're like, it's just lost to us at this point. Clearly, it wasn't something that we needed. It wasn't going to add to the inspired word of God in our canon, but it's pretty interesting. There were writings and there were transmissions that people were familiar with. Second Chronicles 13:22 talks about the story of the prophet Edo. And didn't you do something about Edo, Gideon? They were saying there's quite a few mentions of Edo, and I think there's more than one Edo in the Bible. But the prophet of Edo, we're not familiar with those writings. We don't have any indication of that. And then also, quite a few cases talks about the Chronicles of the Kings of Israel and the Chronicles of the Kings of Judah. These are separate from our Chronicles. So these are also separate books that they were familiar with in biblical times that we don't have. So and there's more examples than this. There's quite a few examples that are mentioned that of works that for some reason we just don't have. So I think that's pretty interesting. And that tells me not only was there oral transmission going on, there probably was some form of writing, at least later on. So I had to pull this up. I'm sorry, but how do we know Moses wrote Leviticus? So this is just the Babylon Bee. Man, people are gonna love reading this one. Says Moses when writing Leviticus, because Genesis Exodus was such a hit. Anyway, thought it was funny. So how do we know Moses was the author of the law, or the Torah is what the Hebrews call it, or the Pentateuch is just Greek, but it's all basically just the first five books of the Bible. Again, if he did write it, which we think he writes it, because there's some verses that indicate that, like Christ says, the word of Moses. So we're pretty sure that would make sense. Now, was it just Moses writing? No, because how could he write about his own death, and how could he write about what happens after his death? Unless God gave him those inspired words, but it's likely he had other writers with him. Maybe Joshua. We don't know. We don't know. Maybe it was all him, but we think he was a big part of this. And so, how do we know this? Well, there's a few different verses that kind of suggest to us, hey, maybe he was the author. So one in Acts 7:22 just talks about his wisdom. So I pull up Acts 7:22. And Moses was learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and was mighty in words and mighty in deeds. Now, maybe not at first when he wanted to talk about letting the people go, but eventually he was mighty in words, he was mighty in deeds. When we look at Exodus 24, verses 3 and 4, and Moses came and told the people all the words of the Lord and all the judgments, and the people answered with one voice and said, all the words which the Lord has said will we do. And Moses wrote all the words of the Lord and rose up early in the morning and built an altar. And so Moses is writing stuff right here. We're told that. Again, in Deuteronomy is the same thing. Moses is writing these laws. Moses is writing these different commandments. And of course, he brought down the Ten Commandments that God wrote. But then we have some references specifically from Christ about Moses. So then if we look at Mark 12:26, it just is one example. They're all very similar though. And so these are the words of Christ. As touching the dead that they rise, have you not read in the book of Moses how in the bush God spake unto him and said, I am the God of Abraham, of Isaac, and Jacob? And there's a couple other verses there, but they're all saying the same thing. Where Christ is like, hey, there's a lot of indication that this would be Moses who wrote these. So that's generally why it's thought, and that's generally the date why they think Moses wrote this. There's probably other authors. We don't know. It's fun to speculate about, but we can argue it all day. And so this chronological order to the right, I just stole that from the internet. But what it goes through is because our Bible is not in chronological order. But generally the first few chapters are pretty good. But if you look here, if you can see this, it goes Genesis and then Job, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and then it kind of moves around a little bit. And so why in the world do they think Job was written so long ago? And they don't know. There's different controversy here. But the reason is, well, there's a couple of reasons. One, there's no reference to Israel, the Mosaic Law, or the Exodus. And, just because of that doesn't mean anything. But they're like, well, that could be the fact that predates this. Job was also from the land of Uz. The land of Uz is very similar terminology for the land around where Abraham was from. So, like, maybe this is more Abrahamic type of time. Because they don't know exactly where the land of Uz was. That seems to be the name given to a certain area around that time, more the time of Abraham. And then the other thing is the archaic Hebrew. When they find Job in some of the oldest renditions, it's in this archaic Hebrew that wasn't really being used much later on, especially after the kingdoms of Israel and Judah were taken away. So all those things are why scholars are like, this is pretty interesting. There's all these indications this might be a pretty old book, and maybe it was written by Moses. We don't know. Maybe it was one of these books that predates what Moses wrote, and it just happened to be with us for lessons, or I just think it's interesting. It's very interesting. Okay, I can't not talk about archaeology. I told myself this is going to be first principles, no archaeology, and then I do a Google search again, like can you does archaeology and history back up the Bible? And then you just get angry because no, there's no proof. It's a fairy tale. It's a story. Even the Catholic Church and blah blah blah. And I'm like, who are they reading? It just doesn't make any sense. So anyway, Is there historical archaeological if you don't take any religious viewpoint to back up the Bible? Yeah, tons. Thank you very much, Google. And so I just put a few up here that I've talked about in the past. So one are the Limu list and the annals, I always say annals, the annals of the Assyrian kings. The Assyrians were very annal about writing down the dates of their kings and their battles. And remember, most of these guys only talk about good stuff. And so if they lose, they don't carve that. But if they win, they put dates, they put times, and the Assyrians are really good with putting in geological stuff. So because of the Assyrians putting in, there was a solar eclipse during this king, and we know when the solar eclipse was, we can start getting a little more specific with their dates. So this solar eclipse, I think, is going to correspond with Nineveh and Jonah. And what Amos talks about this solar eclipse. So we can know between Assyrian archaeology and the Bible that this was probably around 763. So that gives us a date where we build our dates. Now, these might not be perfect because the calendar changes, but that gives us all a pretty good idea of when this took place. The Black Obelisk of Shalmaneser III, it talks specifically about Ahab. It talks about Jehu. It collaborates these kings from the Bible, and it gives dates because they were specific with geological issues. Cyrus, if you read anything before the Cyrus cylinder was found, they're like, this guy didn't exist. There's no way this Persian king is going to let people go back to their land and worship their gods. Well, we have this Cyrus cylinder, and Cyrus is saying we're going to let people go back to their lands and worship their gods. So they're like, oh, well, I guess that was true. The Burneth the steel, the oldest reference of Israel as a nation, and that was carved about 1210 BC. The Teldan steel, the Moabite stone. Not only does it talk about Yahweh, these are one of the first ones that talk about the house of David. So before us, David never existed. There's no proof of David, never happened. Oops. There's actually two really old stone carvings that talks about the house of David. What other Davids is going to be? Especially relating to the children of Israel and relating to Yahweh. The Babylonian Chronicles, very specific to the Bible. They talk about, list all the kings of Babylon. They talk about Nebuchadnezzar. They date the fall of Jerusalem. They date Zedekiah. They date when it's destroyed. So that's how we get our dates of all this. I mean, they're very specific with putting these dates down. We got Hezekiah's tunnel. There's tons of evidence. None of it goes against the Bible. None of it. Even though they thought Esther did, but it doesn't. All of it just supports the Bible. So I think this is huge. I wish Google would look at this. So, but then you'll read and be like, no, because there's all this pre-Bible archaeology that tells you these are just stories, and all these different people believe these same stories, and the Bible is just a different version of the stories. And so what they'll do is they'll find these pieces, these few little pieces. Well, this one is the Enuma Elish. It's the seven tablets of creation. It's an old Assyrian Empire tablets that goes through this study, the story of creation, and Marduk was their god, and how he created the earth and created the waters, and he created the first people, and it's just sort of a Babylonian or I'm sorry, an Assyrian myth. It takes what was probably transferred correctly from the Jewish people, from the people of God, and then they add their false gods and they add, the Tigris and Euphrates came out of the eyeballs of Marduk, and then the people, so they kind of have an idea of the Garden of Eden, but they mess it up. And so this doesn't prove to me that these stories have always existed in the Bible as another version. This tells me that there were a lot of people that didn't follow God and they had the oral transmission, they had the oral testament, they even maybe had writings, but they paganized it. They made it for their own good. The Epic of Gilgamesh, the oldest poem found in mankind. And this talks about a great flood. It's about Gilgamesh who wanted to find out how to become immortal, and it talks about a flood. Now, the flood was only like a week, but there was a flood that covered the earth, and the boat went down. They sent out birds to find dry land. It's just a copy of the Bible where they add all this pagan stuff to it. But the Bible tells us about this because if we look at all the false gods mentioned in the Old Testament, I just found these in like 10 minutes. I'm sure there's more. But we're warned about all these people. These people not far, well, before the flood, but after the flood that starts worshiping false gods. And if we look down there, Marduk is even one mentioned in the Bible. That's the same false god in the Enuma Elish. So when I read that old stuff, I'm not like, oh, these stories have been around for centuries and the Bible is just another version. No, these stories have been around since the beginning of time, but we're told in the Bible there's all these people that worship false gods. And so wouldn't it make sense they would take that oral testament and they would paganize it or they make it fake? So this stuff here doesn't prove anything. It just proves these stories have been around forever, maybe in writing, and there's a plenty of groups which were told in the Bible that distort them. That's my 2 cents. All right. So how do they write? So this is kind of cool. Like we talked about, they would carve, they would do engravings in clay at first, but you're not going to get huge amount of works with that. Then we have papyrus, which is just a plant, and then we have parchment, which is animal skin. So I thought that was kind of neat. So I put a few slides in on this because I didn't know any of this, honestly. I'll act like I do, but I didn't. So the early writing materials, whether we're talking about scrolls or codex, the first one was papyrus. It dates back forever. 3000 BC. It was first used, they think, by the Egyptians because the papyrus plant is a water-based plant and it was prolific around the Nile. And so what they would do is they use this to build everything. Canoes. Moses was actually put in a papyrus, whatever, boat. They use it for everything. Um, but this was the original form. And so there is some references in the Bible where this papyrus, which they called at the time of rush or bulrush, is mentioned all over. So I thought it'd be kind of interesting to read a few of these. Get out of my Bible app. So if we look at Exodus 2:3, and I think Isaiah is talking about Moses too. So we'll just read one of these. So Exodus 2, verse 3. And when she could no longer hide him, she took him, this is talking about Moses, for him in an ark of bulrushes and daubed it with slime and pitch and put the child wherein. So this rush or bulrush or papyrus is this plant. They use it like crazy. If we looked at Job chapter 8, verse 11, can the rush grow up without mire? Can the flag grow without water? And there's a bunch of other examples of that. So this was a pretty common plant they used for a lot of building. But what they would do, and there's videos on YouTube, but I didn't include it because they're too long and they're boring. But they would take the stem of the papyrus plant, they would cut it, and then they would hammer it down. They'd soak it and hammer it until it's flat. And then they would hammer them in cross patterns and until they dried. And then take a shell and they'd scrape them up and then they could at that point write on them. So they'd use different types of red or black ink. But what I thought was interesting when they talk about we're going to blot your name out of the book of life, and this is the stuff they were using back then. That's what they would do. It's water soluble. It didn't go deep. So if they made a mistake, they could just put a little water on it and they could wipe it off. They could blot it out before they wrote again. Or once it dried, if they had enough layers, they would just simply take a shell and scrape off the layer and rewrite. So like this was very easy material to make corrections. So when I was reading about I'm going to blot you out of the book of life, I'm like, that makes total sense for the time. That's how they did it in the papyrus. So that's really interesting. But it's also not very stable and you really got to keep it airtight and so a lot of the papyrus we still have examples of that go back thousands of years, but most of it's not going to last. So then they came up with parchment, and parchment's just animal skin basically. Parchment itself could be from sheep, goat, or cow skin. And then a lot of times they talk about vellum, and vellum is just high quality parchment. It's only young calf skin. It's more elastic, it's whiter, it's smoother than parchment. So all vellum is parchment, but not all parchment is vellum. We have an inside thing. So anyway, this shows how it goes. And so from Wikipedia, I thought this was interesting. Papyrus is generally our graduate. So papyrus started way back when, and maybe a couple centuries later, a couple thousand years later, they got into the parchment. So papyrus is gradually overtaken in Europe by a rival writing surface that rose in prominence as parchment, which is made from animal skins. And by the beginning of the fourth century, most important books were made in parchment, and then even some of the important papyrus books were transferred to parchment. So the parchment they knew was going to last a lot longer. So it makes sense they started transferring and doing everything into parchment. So we're going to see a lot more parchment starting at about 2000 or so. So we have scrolls as the original form of writing. They were just long papyrus they would bang together, or maybe parchment, depending on the year, and they would put all those in a scroll, in a wound up scroll. And so there's a couple old ones that we found that were pretty interesting. Again, that proves this word of God has been around forever, even before Moses wrote down the Old Testament, or the first 5 books. And so the Nash Papyrus, before they found the Dead Sea Scrolls, this was the bread and butter. This is gold. It was found in 1902. It is an old papyrus, so it's pretty old. It was written in Hebrew. It has the Ten Commandments and has, "Oh, hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord," from Deuteronomy, and a few other things. So they're like, okay, this is second century BC. This is some old stuff. It looks like the word of the Bible has been maintained very accurately. Then we get the Dead Sea Scrolls. And so these are 900 manuscripts. I don't think I realized this. This is multiple, multiple copies from different years of the Bible. And again, the only one they haven't found completely is Esther. So that's why like Esther isn't real, it never existed. Well, not true. They're actually showing fragments now they think was actually from Esther. And maybe Nehemiah Esther was one extension, but there hasn't been a complete Esther found. Every other book of the Bible has been found there. There's multiple different copies. And so when they found the Dead Sea Scrolls, they're like, this is a lot older. This is from the third century BC or older, which now they think it might even be older than that. But the big thing about the Dead Sea Scrolls is it's the discovery that the Hebrew Bible has been translated century by century over millennia without much change. It has been very accurately transcribed over thousands of years, which is amazing. So we can look at the Dead Sea Scrolls from the third century and it almost matches what we're reading today. I mean, that's really impressive. But there's a couple things they found. 12 of the books were written in Old Hebrew, that Paleo Hebrew. And so they said the Paleo Hebrew, the last time it was spoken readily was before the exile, before the Babylonians took over Judah. So they say when we had the judges and when we had the separate kingdoms, this ancient Old Hebrew or Paleo Hebrew was common in the 8th and 7th centuries. But once they got pulled into Babylonian exile, it went to Aramaic. The Babylonians, the early Persians, they all spoke a form of Aramaic. So this old Hebrew kind of went away and it wasn't common. It wasn't maybe in some writings, but most of the writing and most of the speech changed. So if we're finding things that are written in Old Hebrew, which a few of the Dead Sea Scrolls were, they're like, that really predates the dates we think that is. Because that was not commonly used. That's an old, ancient type of Hebrew. It's not even close to what they use today. Because they said with Hebrew, it kind of went out. They started speaking Aramaic and Greek and all that thousands of years ago. Yeah, actually. And then only Hebrew being spoken as a language came about in the 19th century. So it was around for study and writing, but the Jews weren't speaking that. They were doing Greek, they were doing other things. So it's kind of a Hebrew went dead for quite a while because they had other forms. And then it got picked up again in the 19th century as a communication form. So that's interesting. And then another one with Dead Sea Scrolls just came out in 2025. They're trying to use AI because every time they do carbon dating, they have to tear up some of this. They don't want to do that. So they started taking their old material using an AI form to date the Dead Sea Scrolls. And the AI, I don't understand it. It's called Enoch, but it's actually dating these older than what they originally thought. So these Dead Sea Scrolls might go back, some of these might go back even farther than what they thought. But we don't even have to worry about Dead Sea Scrolls because since 1990 or 1980, something even older has been found. So these Hinnom scrolls are two little silver scrolls. They think it was wore around a necklace. They were little pieces of silver. They weren't meant to be read because they're too small. But when they found these in 1980 and they slowly unrolled them, they're like, this is amazing. There's carvings in the inside of the scrolls that kind of mimic what's said in Numbers 6:24 through 26. I can't remember what that says, so I should look it up. Numbers. It's not, it's almost word for word, but not exactly. Oh, yeah, the Lord bless thee and keep thee. The Lord make thy face shine upon thee and be gracious unto thee. It's almost word for word, but as you can tell, there's some parts missing. So they're like, this is incredible. This dates back to the 7th century. So this is older than any Dead Sea Scroll could possibly be. This is the oldest biblical reference to Yahweh. This way precedes the Dead Sea Scrolls. But again, it's evidence that these books, one, they've been transcribed almost perfectly word for word. But two, it goes against the people that says, oh, Moses didn't write it. All this stuff was written long after the exile. It was written sometime after Babylonian took them over, or sometime after they reestablished the Second Temple. And this says, well, no, that's not true. They couldn't have been written there because this precedes that, and we have some of the exact same words there, and maybe even some of the Dead Sea Scrolls, predate that. So it's really amazing that the Word of God, especially with the Old Testament here, I mean, it seems to be word for word, and it just goes back as far as we can find. All right. So then, okay, so then we get into codexes, and the codex is when they're like, hey, instead of scrolling this, let's fold this stuff over, maybe put some stone or some gold or some leather on the outside. So it's kind of our book that we have. And so then we have some of these old codexes that are pretty interesting. And the Masoretic text is the first complete manuscript of the Hebrew Bible. So this is the oldest complete where everything's put together in one Bible that we have. The text is complete Hebrew. On which all the modern translations come from. So this is kind of the forefather, I should say, of our current Old Testament. And the oldest one around right now is this Leningrad Codex from 1000 BC. So they're like, this is awesome because it's really old. But the interesting thing that I found about this, I'm just going to read it because it's too much for me to memorize. But the earliest copies of the Hebrew Bible were written without vowels or accents, as Hebrew did not represent vowels in the Middle Ages. To preserve the traditional spoken readings, starting in the 5th century, a group of Jewish scribes known as the Masoretes carefully selected, copied, and annotated Bible scrolls. They added vowels and accents to the ancient Hebrew consonants. Through the Masoretic scribes, though they added these vowels to the ancient text long after it's been written, they were preserving the vocalizations. And so I thought this was really interesting. They actually tried to reproduce it, but reproduce it with vowels and accents, so it actually you could read it and it sounds like probably how the oral history was transferred on. So that's pretty neat to me. And then we have the Septuagint. It's called either the Old Greek or the Septuagint or the 70, because they say between 70 and 72 scholars put this together. So it's always the LXX or the Septuagint or the Old Greek, all means the same thing. But this is the first known translation of the Hebrew Bible into Old Greek. So instead of, we got the Hebrew, now we got the Greek. And so there's some interesting things with the Septuagint. And this is just a quote from an article. It seems there wasn't an official project to translate the Bible into ancient Greek. Instead, many different Greek-speaking Jews in various times and places simply translated their favorite books. Some of these books were later chosen to be included in the Bible, some were not. And so the ones that weren't are this Apocrypha, which just means hidden books. So in the Septuagint and in some of these older findings, we have the current canon, but we also have these Apocrypha books. And most of these Apocrypha books, so the books that aren't in our canon, were written between 300 and 100, and they were found not to be divinely inspired. They didn't add anything, or most of these are just historical anyway. So I copied this off the internet, but who accepts these apocryphal books? And most of it's Catholicism. Roman Catholicism, Greek Orthodox, Russian Orthodox, or that Coptic is like a early Egyptian, but it's still kind of a Catholicism. And so these can be historical books, but they weren't ever agreed to really be part of the canon. So I thought that was pretty interesting. And Apocrypha means hidden books in Greek. So they transcribed all these books, and we were just in Ireland recently, and they have this book of Kells. So not only did they transcribe this word for word and letter for letter, they also were very beautiful. They had fine colors and drawings and all this artwork that they did when they transcribed this. So some of these monks and scholars spent their entire life meticulously making sure word by word and all these pictures are drawn in. So I thought that was pretty neat. And even Josephus, if we look back at the 1st century, he says there was 22 Old Testament books, which again, they're different order. They seem to match our current 39 books. And even Josephus is saying, for are those such long ago have passed, no one has ventured neither to add or remove or to alter a syllable. So even he was saying, this book seems to have been like this for an awful long time. It seems to be transcribed exactly. And this is 1st century when he's talking about this. So I think that's really neat. Um, and so this is the video I watched. I thought it was pretty interesting. It's a claymation, but it's only 4 minutes. So I thought this would be kind of valuable just to watch.
Along the shores of the Dead Sea, 3 Bedouin shepherds were tending their flocks when one of their goats strayed from the herd. Thinking it had wandered into a cave, one of them threw a stone to scare the animal out. The unexpected sound sparked their curiosity. And inside, the young shepherds uncovered clay jars that contained one of the greatest archaeological discoveries of the 20th century, the oldest biblical text ever found, the first of the Dead Sea Scrolls. The scrolls were handwritten some 2,000 years ago on durable animal skin parchment, with a few written on papyrus. They were mostly composed in Hebrew from right to left, with sheets written in columns, then sewn together, creating a single scroll. For safekeeping, some of them would be wrapped in linen and encapsulated in tall jars. The scroll was eventually replaced by the Codex as the format for Christian manuscripts. They were made by folding sheets of papyrus and stitching them together. As time passed, codices began to grow larger and more complex. During the medieval period, books were reproduced by hand. Monks spent their days copying texts in Latin and Greek, while others illustrated the pages. It was a grueling process that required great skill and training. The books were very expensive. To illuminate the text, they used various pigments and gold leaf. And the pages could require the hides of hundreds of sheep or calves. But it was the introduction of the printing press that transitioned the Bible from the Middle Ages into the early modern world. This invention revolutionized book production, ultimately making the Bible available to the masses. Today, it is the best-selling book of all time. Inside its pages, you can find the stories of.
All right, that's good. We're gonna move on. I just thought it was kind of cool. All right, so what about the New Testament? So we got the Old Testament. It's been around forever in different forms. It seems to have been very specifically reproduced, which I think God's hands clearly in that we're getting the exact word he wants us to get. The Greek New Testament, written usually between 48 and 125. We know the authors of most of them. Um, so what we have right now, as far as the oldest original document, because the original documents are long gone. That's why it's so important they were meticulously copied and created. So we get old ones, but we're not getting the originals. But this Codex Sinaiticus, I probably mispronounced that. It's the oldest Greek New Testament original that they have. And so from this crash course of the Bible history, they say this is one of the most important books in the world. It was handwritten over 1600 years ago. The manuscript contains the Christian Bible in Greek, including the oldest copy of the New Testament. So this is the Old Testament plus the New Testament plus some of the Apocrypha books. But it again just goes to show these have been transcribed very exactly, so the words have stayed the same. So, how did this Bible canon that we have get put together? Well, a lot of times they'll credit Athanasius of Alexandria. He wrote a letter every year in the 39th festal level letter. I've never heard of this in my life. But when they say that our current canon really can go back to him. So, on his 39th letter to the churches, when they got together for these meetings, he wrote uh, an acknowledgement of what is called the closed canon of the Bible. And what he said is, although disputed and it was talked about for another hundreds and hundreds of years, his letter ultimately mirrored what would become the canonical New Testament, drawing a sharp line between the texts he thought for ecclesiastical use and those he thought were apocrypha. And so, though it still got argued for quite a while, if they go back and say these are the books that Athanasius said should be the closed canon on his 39th festal letter, that's pretty much what we have today. So I think this is already kind of known, like, hey, we know what's good in the Hebrew. This has been around for thousands of years. We have a pretty good idea what should be in the New Testament and what's apocryphal. And so it's pretty interesting, even though there wasn't one time when our canon was put together. Already back in the 200s, it was kind of still, they're going to argue about it, but it was kind of already set. So then we have different translations because most of us aren't going to be real good at Greek or Hebrew or Aramaic. Um, and oh, by the way, the Old Testament's mostly in Hebrew, but there is some Aramaic. They say like Daniel, Jeremiah, Ezra, a couple of those that are post-exilic were written in Aramaic because the old Hebrew started to go away. Once you start with Nebuchadnezzar on, you're going to get more and more Aramaic and then eventually Greek. And so it makes sense that some of the Bible would be in Aramaic, at least the copies we have. So then you got Saint Jerome. He wrote the Latin Vulgate. So this is the first complete transcription from the old Hebrew and Greek into Latin. So he just made a Latin Bible, and this is for the church basically, so they could do their talks in Latin. So nobody knew what they were talking about. Then you got Wycliffe. Wycliffe is the first English Bible. So you have Jerome taking the Hebrew and Greek into Latin, and then Wycliffe took the Latin and put the first English Bible. So the very first Bible written in our English language, which we wouldn't understand today because this is the Old English, was Wycliffe's Bible. And he did two different versions. The early version was word for word. It made no sense and nobody could read it. So they came along with the Wycliffe and they did later versions, which actually kind of made more sense as far as translating it to something that would make sense in English. So Wycliffe gets credit to have the first English Bible. The Gutenberg Bible was just, it was basically the Latin Vulgate. It wasn't a new Bible. It was the Vulgate, the Latin Vulgate, but it was the first one to be mass produced. So the Bible is the first book ever printed on a printing press with movable type. And this finally allowed it to be reproduced and getting out to the public. Because the Catholic Church at the time, you could not read. We'll read to you. Any mercy you get, any blah, blah, blah comes from the church. And William Tyndale was like, I don't think so. So this Tyndale is really what we're reading today when we look at the King James. It's unbelievable. This guy was Oxford trained. He was a scholar. He was fluent in six languages. So he knew Hebrew, he knew Greek, he knew English, obviously, and then I think some of the French and Spanish and all that. And he's the one that by reading the Bible himself, he's like, we shouldn't be getting our redemption and we shouldn't be forgiven by the church. It should be through the grace of God and through Jesus. So he kind of had a pretty good understanding of all this. So his idea was, I am going to be exact as I can. I'm not going to go to the Latin Vulgate. I know Hebrew and I knew Greek, so I'm going to transfer these word for word into English. So the Tyndale Bible was the first English Bible translated directly from Hebrew and Greek. It's also the first English Bible that was printed in large copies. And there is pages about this William Tyndale, but there were so many interesting things I just put on the slide. His Bible introduced new words to the English language, such as Passover, scapegoat, salt of the earth, signs of the time, apple of his eye, blessed are the peacemakers. All these were his interpretation of the Latin into English. He decided to use elder instead of bishop, repent instead of do penance. He's the one that said congregation instead of church. I think he's the one that came up with ecclesia. He came up with all these different words, really kind of saying, hey, church, you don't have power. I'm taking it from the power. I want to make this so it's easy to read because a lot of people are going to be illiterate, but I wanted them to understand when we read this Bible out loud. So the church didn't think much of him. They strangled him and burned him to death before he could finish it. So though he didn't finish it, this Miles Coverdale, which probably worked with him, he actually finished this book, so it was completed. But Tyndale was a pretty interesting guy. I was looking into some of his he still believes in Trinity and stuff, but it's pretty interesting that he had some pretty similar faith, more of a Protestant faith than what you would think of as like Catholicism. And that reminded me of one thing. I want to go back to this guy. Athanasius of Alexandria was the big one at the Council of Nicaea where they adopted Trinity that pushed for Trinity. There was this Arianism or this Arius who's like, Christ is the Son of God, not God the Son. And so it was this big fight. A lot of the people didn't think there should be a Trinity, but unfortunately, Athanasius with Constantinople are the ones that pushed the bishops and they actually voted to officially accept Trinity. So though he accepted the canon plus for you, he pushed Trinity, minus for you. Okay, so the Tyndale book is very similar to the King James. So there's been multiple studies that estimates about 80% of Tyndale's New Testament is is reproduced in the King James version. And I put this on one of the other ones, but this is just one specific study, and they did 18 samples and compared King James with Tyndale. And for the New Testament, 84% is the same, and the Old Testament, 76%. So a lot of how we read the Bible today, we give, Tyndale is the one who did it. But then we get into the King James. So the Tyndale Bible, again, we're in the 1500s. The King James Bible came out in 1611, so less than 100 years. But by 1611, there were a lot of books in English already. There was the Great Bible, the Bishop's Bible, the Geneva Bible, this Douay Rheims Bible. Most of these, though, were English Bibles translated from Latin. So they didn't have quite the same translation because now you're going from one to another to another. So King James of England and King James VI of Scotland, they wanted to unite the people. They wanted to have one consolidated English book. So they got 50 scholars together. Clearly, these 50 scholars were influenced by Tyndale's Bible because it was a very good Bible. But they wanted to put it more between Old and Middle English. They wanted to make it a little more current because it's hard enough to believe by this time the other English seemed, kind of archaic. And so their result for the King James Bible was they put a high value and resulting text being readable and understandable in the common language of the day because English was already changing. Their final product was not intended for scholars, but to be read aloud in churches, very much so like what Tyndale wanted. So it's really kind of a neat progression that our King James Bible really came from the Hebrew and Greek, not being influenced by Latin. All right, so this is just some fun facts again. So our Bible canon, as we read it today, wasn't finalized till the fourth century. So again, we had all these separate writings. Sometimes they add apocryphal books, sometimes they didn't. But most of the time, they knew which ones were apocryphal, later written books. But it wasn't canonized at a single moment, but rather through a process. So it started back in the 300s when he recommended it. And then we got the Council of Nicaea, the Council of Hippo, the Council of Carthage. And even up to the 1400s, they were saying this is the final canon. But the cool thing is, it's pretty much always the same books they're arguing about. There wasn't a whole lot of difference. This canon has stayed kind of the same. But the way we read it today, the chapters weren't introduced until the 1200s. Having individual verses weren't introduced to the 16th century. So these are long run-on books. So it's really interesting. The way we read it now is relatively new as far as how time goes. First and Second Samuel, First and Second Kings was one book. It was called the Book of Reigns, and it was a huge scroll. So they divided that up into separate books and chapters and verses. First and Second Chronicles, Ezra, and Nehemiah was one book. They said it was divided in four parts just because the scrolls weren't long enough. So then it makes sense that we're going to divide these into separate books. Luke and Acts were originally one book. So, I mean, this is pretty interesting to me. The current books of the Bible, with the chapters, the verses, all that, really didn't become fixed until about the 15th century. Because once they started printing it, it made sense that, okay, we need to be able to find these things. So we need to have a way to find them. So we do chapters, verses, and then we can print them like that. So I thought that was pretty interesting. And right now, there's over 900 different types of English books, but most of them aren't complete. There's about 100 complete English books today. Everything from word to word, which King James is kind of in this word to word. And then we have like the NIV or the NAB that are kind of thought. So it's trying to make it more current English where they keep the thoughts correct or they keep the things correct, but it's easier to understand, all the way to paraphrasing books, where it just kind of messes it all up. So a lot of people will say you should have more of a word for word book and a thought for thought book to compare in case you're not understanding the English. The paraphrasing is kind of silly. There's not, you lose a lot of accuracy with that.